A vast cemetery stood on the edge of the sea, where ancient stone paths wound between weathered monuments, forgotten names, and statues slowly worn smooth by rain, salt, and time, and beyond those silent graves the ocean moved endlessly beneath the sky, painted in dark blue and fading gold, as if night itself were slowly swallowing the last evidence of day. And despite the silence, the place was not empty, because silence does not belong only to the dead. Sometimes it belongs to the living who have forgotten how to truly live. And on that evening, mourners, priests, travelers, widows, soldiers, and quiet strangers walked between rows of stone carrying flowers, memories, regrets, and invisible conversations they never had the courage to finish. And among them walked Friedrich Nietzsche, calm, unhurried, untouched by the heaviness surrounding him, as if death itself were not something to fear, but something to observe. And that difference did not go unnoticed, because people become aware of calm most clearly when they themselves are quietly afraid. And one of the younger men nearby, dressed in black, his hands trembling slightly as he stared toward a freshly covered grave, finally looked toward Nietzsche and asked a question that sounded simple but carried something far heavier beneath it, asking why the thought of death feels heavier than death itself, why people spend entire lives avoiding conversations they know cannot be avoided forever, and why even those who say they are alive often seem to move through life as if something inside them has already disappeared. And the question moved through the cemetery like cold wind across old stone, because everyone who heard it recognized something personal within it. And fear, unlike philosophy, rarely feels abstract, and Nietzsche did not answer immediately. And that silence created something unusual, because in places built to remember endings, silence feels heavier than grief, and heavy silence forces attention. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost soft than the waves breaking against distant cliffs. And he said that most people do not die at the end of life. They die the moment comfort becomes more important than becoming, and the words did not land like comfort. They landed like truth, and truth rarely comforts at first, and the people around him reacted not with agreement, but with confusion, because the statement did not describe death, it redefined it, and redefining something so final creates discomfort, and discomfort, when left without explanation, often turns into resistance. The waves did not stop moving. The wind still carried salt through the narrow stone paths. The names carved into weathered marble remained exactly where time had left them, and yet, somehow, everything began to feel different. Because once a thought begins to move inward, the world outside often becomes quieter, not because it changes, but because attention moves somewhere deeper, somewhere less comfortable, and the mourners, travelers, priests, and strangers walking between those old graves felt that shift, even if they could not fully explain it, because something had been introduced that did not fit with the comfort they had brought with them. And when comfort begins to weaken, awareness begins to grow, and awareness is rarely gentle. Because awareness does not remove fear. It removes the stories people use to avoid it. And the people surrounding him felt that pressure begin to build, not outwardly, but inwardly, because now the question was no longer about death. It was about why living often feels so incomplete in the first place. And personal questions are always harder to escape than philosophical ones. And the young man who had spoken earlier slowly removed his gloves, his hands no longer trembling, his eyes fixed somewhere between the fresh grave and the dark horizon. And after several silent moments, he looked toward Friedrich Nietzsche again, this time without performance, without intellectual distance, and asked what exactly dies inside a person long before the body does. And the question carried something new, not resistance, not challenge, but vulnerability. And vulnerability is always more honest than certainty, because it appears when something real has finally been touched. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that what dies first is not courage, but possibility. And the words moved to the cemetery differently this time, because they did not explain fear, they exposed surrender. And exposure is far more difficult to resist than contradiction, because contradiction creates defense, but exposure creates reflection, and reflection is slower, heavier, and far more difficult to escape. And Nietzsche continued, saying that most people are not destroyed by tragedy, failure, loss, or pain, but by repetition, by mournings that feel identical to the ones before them, by ambitions quietly postponed until they become memories, by truth swallowed to preserve approval, by talents hidden to avoid criticism, by love never, spoken to avoid rejection, and by dreams carefully reduced until they no longer threaten the comfort of the life already built. And the words settled into mourners with quiet weight, because they did not describe fear as panic. They described it as routine, and routine is something people rarely recognize as danger, because what feels stable often hides decay, and what feels responsible often hides surrender, and the people around him felt that idea begin to move through them, not as agreement, but as tension, because now death was no longer something buried beneath stone, no longer something announced by bells, ceremonies, or final breaths. It had become something far more personal, something internal, something that reached beyond the cemetery itself. And one of the older women standing near a weathered statue slowly lowered the flowers in her hands, her expression harder to read than before, and asked whether courage always requires losing something first. And the question hung between sea wind and silence longer than expected, because everyone standing nearby recognized something personal within it, and Nietzsche looked toward her, not with sympathy, not with cruelty, but with clarity, and said that courage begins the moment comfort stops being sacred. And the words moved deeper than anything before them, because they removed the comforting illusion that bravery belongs only to soldiers, heroes, martyrs, or legends, and instead they place responsibility where most people least want it, within ordinary choices, ordinary mornings, ordinary conversations, ordinary risks never taken. And the people fell quiet, not because they agreed, but because something within them had already begun to shift, something that could not be undone through denial alone. And Nietzsche, seeing that shift, did not push harder, did not raise his voice, because the cemetery had already done enough. And instead, he said that the most tragic graves are not the ones filled too early, but the ones filled with people who never truly arrived in their own lives. And the words settled into the sea air with quiet finality. The waves did not stop moving. The wind still carried salt through the narrow stone paths. The names carved into weathered marble remained exactly where time had left them. And yet, somehow, everything began to feel different, because what they were feeling was not grief. It was something far more unsettling, a quiet realization that death may not begin with endings, but with the first truth you were too afraid to live. And for the first time, the cemetery no longer felt like a place for the dead. It felt like a mirror for the living. The sea did not grow calmer. The wind did not soften. The names carved into ancient stone remained exactly where time had left them. And yet, somehow none of it felt the same, because something had shifted, not in the cemetery, not in the ocean rising and falling beyond the cliffs, not in the quiet footsteps moving between graves, flowers, and unfinished goodbyes, but in the way those endings were now being understood. And that difference was enough to change everything, because once a person begins to understand death differently, life itself no longer holds the same meaning, and the people standing beneath the darkening sky felt it, even if they could not fully explain it, because something had been introduced that did not require agreement to exist, something that had already begun to alter the way they understood fear, safety, routine, ambition, and the invisible compromises each of them had made long before. They ever called it maturity, and that alteration is what makes an idea dangerous, not because it creates fear, but because it removes excuses. And Friedrich Nietzsche stood calmly within that silence, not as someone untouched by loss, but as someone who had stopped asking life to guarantee meaning before living it. And that difference was impossible not to notice, because guarantees comfort people, but uncertainty transforms them. And the young man who had spoken first looked toward him again, his voice quieter now, stripped of performance, stripped even of fear, asking what happens to those who realize too late that they spent their lives surviving, but never truly living. And the question carried something new, not resistance, not challenge, but honesty. And honesty is always heavier than certainty, because it appears when performance finally ends. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that late awakening is painful, but unconscious living is fatal. And the words moved to the cemetery with a kind of quiet force, because they did not glorify death. They stripped life of performance. And performance is what most people hide behind when truth becomes too personal. And Nietzsche continued, saying that many people, believe death waits at the end of life. But what often ends first is courage, then curiosity, then desire, then honesty, then risk, until eventually a person continues breathing long after they have stopped becoming. And the mourners felt that idea settle into them with quiet weight, because now death was no longer something to fear, no longer something to postpone, no longer something to discuss in whispers beside stone. It had become something to recognize, and recognition is far heavier than grief, because grief asks you to remember, but recognition asks you to change, and change is what most people fear more than death itself. And the cemetery fell silent, not because anyone agreed, but because something within them had already begun to shift, something that could not be undone through denial alone. And Nietzsche walked slowly toward the edge of the cliffs where dark waves shattered endlessly against black stone, and without turning back, he spoke one final time, saying that the greatest tragedy is not dying without enough time. It is die with a life you were always too afraid to claim. And the words settled deeper than anything before them, because they did not promise comfort. They demanded responsibility, and responsibility is always heavier than certainty, because certainty asks you to follow, but life asks you to become, and no one spoke after that, because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to laugh at, nothing left to hide behind. And as Friedrich Nietzsche disappeared slowly into sea mist and fading twilight, the mourners remained exactly where they were, and yet none of them felt the same, because once a person realizes that death was never the real fear, only the mirror that reveals whether they ever truly lived, they cannot fully return to the comfort of who they used to be. The sea did not grow calmer. The wind did not soften. The names carved into ancient stone remained exactly where time had left them, and yet, somehow, none of it felt the same.